Millions of Americans seem to still believe that there was widespread election fraud in the 2020 election. And that worries me because it has been so conclusively proven to be false. And there is almost basically zero evidence for fraud, certainly for widespread fraud. And the fact of the matter is that you don't need to look to the newspapers, which you might think are biased, or fact checkers, which some people seem to dismiss. You can actually look to the court cases. The democratic institutions that we have are both the best way to find truth at the moment and also what we need to defend against this post-truth society. And one of the reasons that we need to save our democratic institutions is because they are a way that we can find truth in the midst of so much disinformation. Now, Trump and some of the GOP would have you believe that the courts were unwilling to look at the cases, threw them out on standing, were somehow of bad faith, which is the exact opposite of the truth. They came to the courts in bad faith. And you can see this if you look at the transcripts of the court cases. And the reason that the courts didn't want to look at the cases sometimes or threw them out right at the beginning is not because they were cowards or there was some technicality, and standing is not a technicality. It's because they were so absurd and had no evidence and oftentimes didn't have standing. Now, what is standing? It simply means that someone harmed by whatever the case is meant to be about is willing to be one of the plaintiffs in the case. So in one case, the judge pointed out that notably, the Republican candidate whose name was on the ballot is not a plaintiff in this case. So if there had been fraud, the Republican candidate on the ballot would have been harmed and would presumably have been willing to join as a plaintiff. That doesn't mean that they have to bring the case themselves. They just put their name down to say, yes, I was harmed and I want to join this case. But if there's no evidence of actual harm, then you might have trouble finding someone who's willing to put their name to it. And that is the case in many of these court cases. Standing was only a major part of the reason for throwing out the case in sort of like 5 out of 29 of the ones that I looked at that were thrown out, because many of the cases were actually dropped. In other words, they decided not to go forward with their own case about fraud. They pulled back when they saw that they didn't have enough evidence and it would be thrown out. And they didn't want it to be dismissed with prejudice, as some of them were. So they dropped the case early. Now, most of the ones that I looked at, the judges said things like, there's no evidence. Like, for example, the plaintiff's equal protection claim is not supported by any allegation that they were making, right? The closest the plaintiffs get to alleging that physical ballots were altered is the following statement in a sworn affidavit. I believe some of those workers were changing votes that had been cast for Donald Trump and other Republican candidates. That was the extent of their evidence. In another, the judge says, free, fair elections are the lifeblood of our democracy. Charges of unfairness are serious, but calling an election unfair does not make it so. Charges require specific allegations and then proof. We have neither here. And judges had definite problems with the relief that was asked in these cases. In some cases, the relief they were looking for was to request for an audit. And judges pointed out that actually the canvassing board that would do an audit cannot investigate fraud. So it seems to be a disconnect. In other cases, what they were asking for was discarding of votes. And they would ask very often to discard the votes only in certain counties, only in counties where Trump lost. And this was not lost on the judges. They pointed out that it violated the Equal Protect Clause of their particular state. In the words of one judge, the lawsuit seems to be less about achieving relief, as the relief is beyond the power of the court, and more about the impact of their allegations on people's faith in the democratic process and trust in our government. Plaintiffs asked this court to ignore the orderly statutory scheme established to challenge elections and to ignore the will of millions of voters. So in each case, it seems that the judges recognize that either they're trying to delay the election, they are trying to overturn the election, or they are trying to undermine faith in democracy, or perhaps all three. And there are some really good statements that you can read by these judges, and you can see that the judges are actually pointing to evidence, the evidence of what the plaintiffs are doing, the lack of evidence that the plaintiffs have brought, and you can make up your own mind. Why would Trump and his top GOP supporters want to spread this lie if they have no evidence, and it is a lie, as seems to be the case when you look at all of these court cases? Why would they want to do that? Perhaps they do want to undermine belief in democracy and trust in institutions. Perhaps because Trump wanted to overturn the election and wanted power that he could not have in an actual democracy. Perhaps they wanted to confuse people and bring about a post-truth society, as Putin has done in Russia. And the final bit of evidence, if you're still wondering whether these people believe what they're saying and don't have these bad faith reasons, well, just look at when they get sued. All of a sudden, they argue things like no reasonable person would conclude that their statements were truly statements of fact, as Sidney Powell said, the Kraken attorney. And Fox News, immediately when they were faced with potential lawsuits, started bringing on experts who could easily refute their claims. Clearly, they knew before that their claims were false. Clearly, if they can turn around that quickly and make an argument that you never should have believed me in the first place and bring on experts who can show that what they said was not true, they never believed it. And yes, they were probably trying to earn profit, and they probably had various other reasons raising money for themselves, whether you're talking about Trump or Fox News. They certainly raised money using this big lie, but clearly there was something else going on. And I think if you do your own investigation, you will find that they had ulterior motives.